immigrants face in our immigration system, and they are often ignored or exacerbated by homophobia and transphobia. The undocumented LGBT immigrants may experience even greater difficulties because of their lack of legal status. So Dr. Chris is going to tell you a little bit more, but I want to introduce her and bring her up. Thank you, Dr. Chris.
Hi, can everybody hear me without the microphone, or is the microphone better?
It's better.
Microphone's better, okay. All right. So, I'm going to get us started today and introduce some of the issues related to not just undocumented immigration in general, but really the intersection, the connection, and the concern that we need to have when we think about immigrant rights and the need to include all people, especially the LGBTQ community. And after I talk for just a few minutes, we're going to have a panel, Miguel and Claudia and Carlos, who are going to come up and we'll have the opportunity to ask some questions and hear really firsthand about how some of the things that I'm going to introduce to you manifest in people's day-to-day lives and the significance of that. And then finally, what we can do as a community to support immigrant rights, but I would go further and say even human and civil rights. Okay? So, by way of a little bit of history, just to get us going and thinking about this. People probably may remember December 18th, 2010 was a really historic day in a number of ways. On that day, the Senate voted to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which made it possible for LGBTQ people to serve openly in the military. But that exact same day, the Senate voted down the Federal DREAM Act, which was a legislation that would have created a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who had completed a college degree or served in military service. And when I talk about this, I always think about, what does this say to people? What does this say to the young people that are here with us today who identify as queer and undocumented? How is it that these kinds of policy decisions really put a wedge, or have the potential to put a wedge between the gay and lesbian community and the immigrant communities? Because the reality is, in a lot of ways, on the surface, the modern gay rights movement, the current immigration movement may seem very dissimilar, but in fact they have more in common than initially meets the eye. Both are pushing for human dignity, for respect, and for quality under the law, and these are the dominant themes in both of these movements. And I think what we're also going to hear about today is the way that the experiences of being gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, queer, and being an immigrant can in fact be quite similar. One of the things that the LGBTQ community and the immigrant community knows is that our opponents are going to continue their fight. We have in many ways the same opponents. Right? People who want to really shut the door and take us back in time. People who are deathly afraid of the changing complexions of our country. And they know that they're going to gain allies by talking about us, by creating and perpetuating stereotypes, and by creating fear. They're going to talk about the ways that gay and lesbians destroy families and confuse children. They're going to talk about how immigrants destroy the economy and steal jobs. We hear this all the time. They're going to say that if a person is transgendered and doesn't look, quote, normal, then they must be unstable. They're going to say if an immigrant doesn't look normal, then they must be a terrorist. Even further, we know that our opponents are going to say to the African American community, walk away from Latino voters because Latino illegals are stealing your jobs that you should have. They're going to say walk away from gay allies because they're stealing the rights that you've already worked for. These are wedge issues. And these wedge issues are really completing us, are preventing us from completing our agendas for equality. Even this morning, I was online and I read an article, and Marco Rubio and John McCain are both standing up and saying that we can't include a consideration for LGBTQ immigrants in the current legislation, and that if we do, that's going to compromise the passage of the whole thing. Now, if that isn't a wedge issue, I don't know what is. So we've got some work to do. And we've got hard work to do. And we need to continue to reflect on how communities can come together, the LGBT community, the immigrant community, but we also need to continue to develop a strong base of allies. And that's why it's important that you're here today, because you can be some of our allies and help us reflect on what are the real needs that we have as communities, and what are the real political possibilities that together can move us forward. Part of this is creating safe spaces. Part of this is engaging in dialogue, and part of this is educating. And so really this is our agenda today. So I want to get a little bit more to the point where I want to go today, which is thinking politically and thinking strategically. Why is it that immigration is an LGBTQ issue and vice versa? Well, we know that there's tens of thousands of queer immigrants out there. In fact, the estimate that I just read this morning that was just published is that there's 900,000 queer immigrants in the United States today. Common opponents, certainly that's a reason that brings us together. But I think that to answer the question, we need to start much further back. Because the reality is, in this country, there's been a large history of discrimination and exclusion of LGBTQ immigrants, and I think it's a silent history. So let me start with just this. Until 1990, immigrants to the United States were denied entry to this country if they admitted to being homosexual. 1990. That's like yesterday, you know? This practice of specifically excluding immigrants who were thought to be homosexuals, again, has a very, very long history. And most of the exclusion has been based around categorizing gays and lesbians as either morally or medically unfit, or casting them as individuals who are perceived to be a social or a political threat to the desirable characteristics of American society. We'll talk a little bit what that means as we go along here. And I'm not going to get you into a real long history lesson. It's scary when you have a professor up here with a PowerPoint sometimes. But I got to do a couple of things. I got to give you a couple of examples, right, to prove my point. So, one example, the PAGE Act. The PAGE Act was actually the first federal immigration law in the United States. And the PAGE Act actually excluded people who, in the legislation says, who have been convicted of crimes involving moral turpitude. Well, this at the time was interpreted as including sodomy. And so you have this law that's on the books that was used 35, 40 years later, where you have examples of a young Greek immigrant. I read a story about a month ago about a young Greek immigrant who in 1912 confessed, the word was, that he had been sexually active with men, and he was immediately deported. And he was Greek, and he was actually deported to Argentina. I'm not quite sure what that was about, but it was a no questions asked policy, right? That really stayed into effect and that did impact many people. Major immigration legislation in 1917 in the United States. In that legislation, the terminology that was used was that people were not permitted to come or remain in the United States if they had a constitutional psychopathic inferiority. And at the time, homosexuality was defined as the result of a permanent psychological defect, by definition, exclusion. Now, remember, these are written into laws. Right? Continuing along the same theme, again, 1952, maintained the same kind of language, but the focus again on mental disorders or psychopathic personalities. So you see this stereotyping, and also an emphasis that I think to some degree still remains, a questioning of one's moral character. Is one morally fit? Now, there certainly were challenges to these laws. The most famous, not going to go into it in detail, but I can talk about it afterwards because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get to the panel. But one of the most famous was Boutier versus the INS. And this was a young man who applied for citizenship in the 1960s. He had migrated with his family from Canada, had lived in the United States for 20 years. He was denied citizenship in the United States, legal status in the United States, and was immediately just deported. He took his case to the Supreme Court, and he lost. So again, I could talk a little bit more about that. But even in 1980, so kind of just really jumping forward in history a little bit here as quickly as I can, even as late as 1980, now this is well after the American Psychiatric Association removes homosexuality from its list of disorders, that's in 1973. The Public Health Services told the INS that they would no longer certify homosexuals as having psychopathic personalities, and yet the US Department of Justice in 1980 still says, and I quote, that they have a legal obligation to exclude homosexuals from entering the United States. So we repealed some of these practices in 1990, but only partly. And the reason I say partly is because in the past 20 years we've seen new issues, new legal limitations for gay, lesbian, transsexuals, queers, even in applying for entry and citizenship in the United States. And we need to continue to protect some of these rights and fight to gain some of these rights. While LGBTQ individuals are no longer barred statutorily from entering the United States, there are immigration laws that continue to discriminate and impact them in many ways. And this is the most prevalent in the area of family immigration. Currently in the United States, a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident in a heterosexual married relationship may petition for their foreign-born spouse to migrate to the United States. But the same right does not apply to same-sex couples. So you have a partner who's an immigrant or who's living in another country, you as a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident don't have the right to petition for them to stay. Now, family reunification is the main vehicle of immigration in this country today. People that come mainly sponsored by other family members. And so we have a system that does not allow those who have established relationships with even American citizens to join their partners in the U.S. And of course, what we know is that DOMA further complicates this. Right? Further complicates this by establishing this federal definition of marriage. And so you have examples of people like Jane and Shirley, who are two women who've been together for 23 years, who have two boys. Jane is a citizen, and Shirley came undocumented from the Philippines. She was fleeing violence, and she came from the Philippines at the age of 21. But now Shirley faces the threat of deportation and separation from her family because there's no immigration law to protect and to help maintain her family. There are currently 36,000 couples in the United States today that are in similar situations, and of these 36,000 couples, half of them have children. Deportations and detentions is another issue that has harsh impacts on all families, but LGBTQ families also, and sometimes in very unique ways. Under the Obama administration, what we've seen is that the deportations in the United States are higher today than they ever have been. We're at a historic high in terms of deporting people. And so this means that all people who are undocumented are constantly under the threat of being separated from their families, from their partners, from their children. Families are being ripped apart because of the deportations and the deportations that are taking place in the United States today. And so it's no accident that we see when we talk to people in our communities that they live in fear. Fear of being separated, fear of losing family members, fear of losing, if one family member gets deported, family income so that their children and their partners can continue to survive and thrive. But there's also the issue of detention centers. Detention centers in the United States have become increasingly privatized and have become more dangerous for all detainees. There's a number of reports that have documented the substandard and overcrowded facilities, the ways that when immigrants are detained, they get treated as criminals, they don't receive the proper medical care, they're not allowed to visit with their family members, etc., etc. But for LGBTQ folks, it's also a dangerous place to be oftentimes, because within the system, they tend to face further discrimination. So we have examples of people like Esmeralda, for example, who is a transgender individual who was put into detention, who faced, because of her sexual orientation, her transgender status, who faced incredible abuse, was handcuffed, denied food, and experienced sexual abuse at the hands of guards and other prisoners. Detention centers for people like Esmeralda are dangerous. But also we see sometimes in detention centers LGBTQ people who are being put into solitary confinement in detention centers, allegedly for their own protection. There was an article in the LA Times last week that made reference to LGBTQ folks in detention centers who sometimes in fact ask to get put into solitary confinement for their own protection. Well, what kind of systems and what kinds of institutions are we talking about when people have to ask to be isolated on their own for their own protection and own safety? These are just some of the issues that are really relevant, again, not just to immigrants in general, but to LGBTQ immigrants in particular. And as I was thinking about this the last few days, I was also thinking about the fact that in our current immigration law, if people are applying to become legal permanent residents or citizens, one of the criteria that people have to meet is they have to meet a test of good moral character. That's a test. That's a determination that needs to be made which allows you to stay in the United States. We have these kinds of stereotypes and fear and misinformation about LGBTQ folks. How is it that their moral superiority is going to be evaluated? That's in question. You know, the truth is, despite this history, we've seen some positive policy changes over the years, and these have been pretty hard-fought battles. We've seen, for example, the HIV Exclusion Act, which was in effect in the United States for 22 years, and finally this was banned in 2009. And this was the legislation that denied people who were infected with the HIV virus to enter the United States. We've seen other kinds of victories around, for example, the issue of asylum. So asylum, right, is the possibility that people have to come to the United States if they're in fear of persecution. This category definition never included people who were who identified differently in terms of their sexuality, but in 1994, homosexuals were specifically included in this. And these two examples, again, are hard-fought battles, and in some ways, really great victories. And, you know, I think it's important, you know, I always remind myself of these victories because they give me hope. I mean, they give me hope that we can effectively work together to bring about social justice. But I also know that we need to be diligent, because even within these relatively favorable contexts, LGBTQ individuals and their families are often subject to stereotypes and unjust application of the law, right? Still have to deal with homophobia and transphobia. And a couple of experiences. I was in a court proceeding once with Norma, actually, who was testifying, and there was a transgendered individual who had applied for asylum in the United States, was afraid because of his, because he was transgendered, he was afraid to go back to his country of origin, literally afraid for his life. So we went to court that day, and he dressed, as I think all of us would, he dressed up, he dressed in a suit, he looked very nice, he looked very presentable, he was going in front of the judge. So he came in a suit, and he was told by the judge that, the judge said, well, I don't believe that you're transgendered. I mean, look at you, you're dressed like a man, you're dressed in a suit. And so I'm gonna deny your asylum application. He threatened to actually throw his asylum claim out of court because of the way he looked. Well, that didn't happen, fortunately, and there was a new court date, and the next time that guy came back, let me tell you, he was dressed to the hilt. Full-blown makeup, full-blown garb. He was dressed in a way he was comfortable.
Yeah.
But look what was at risk for him, because the judge had these stereotypes. I mean, other cases where gays and lesbians have been told by judges that, well, I don't believe you're going to be in any danger going back to your country of origin. You don't look gay. So we have a lot of educating to do, no? And as LGBTQ and immigrant rights advocates, we need to work together. We need to begin by engaging in dialogues, by telling stories, by strengthening our ties across movements, and we also need to strengthen our ally base, those who are not LGBTQ or immigrants, but who are committed to human and civil rights. We need to push for comprehensive, or what we're referring to as compassionate immigration reform, and I think after listening even to some of these stories, I'm reminded of the importance of using the term compassionate immigration reform. We need to promote policies that are more exclusive, that protect families and children first and foremost, all families. And we need to encourage safe and just processes and procedures. We need to repeal DOMA. We'll see what happens by the end of June with DOMA. And that is going to set the stage for where we need to begin to move or continue to move together. And we need to promote citizenship. Because we need to make sure that folks who are in this country, who've lived in this country for years, who are raising families, who are productive members of our community, that we hear those voices. We hear those voices, not just the stories and the experiences, but we hear their voices in the ballot box. When I think back to the civil Supreme Court case in 1967 that I made reference to, this young man who was deported back to Canada, Clyde Boutier, was essentially being told that because he was gay, he wasn't fit to be a citizen in this country. And in some ways, LGBTQ individuals are still being told the same thing. And I think that we as social and human rights activists need to be deeply suspicious that some people are being defined as not good enough to be part of our country. And I think that that question and that challenge needs to be at the center of our movements together.